People Like Us by Rachel Dax, performed by Suzie Rees. Lucinda is sitting in a large conservatory of a London townhouse.
Contrary to popular opinion, it is possible to make an absolute hash of one's love life, even in one's 80s, particularly if one has hesitated. No, I must be completely honest now. If one has resisted because the person one has unexpectedly fallen in love with is of the same sex. Do not misunderstand me. This is not the first time I have fallen in love with another woman. I have had relationships with women as well as men since I was 11 years old. It has been the coming out part that I have struggled with. It is, in fact, my personal belief that no woman is 100% heterosexual. I know some of you may think this is a somewhat contentious assertion, but if you are listening to my story and claim to be a heterosexual woman, then I request you pause for a moment and consider. Was there a girl at school on whom you had a crush? Or perhaps a female teacher? Has there been a female singer or film idol who was the exception to the rule? A woman so utterly entrancing that you wanted to kiss her and touch her, in spite of not wanting to kiss or touch the pretty girl standing next to you. In my day, the exception to the rule was usually Katharine Hepburn, Greta Garbo, or Marlene Dietrich. But I suspect that these days the women who would make a straight girl turn are completely different and not within my sphere of knowledge. This is what I mean when I posit that no woman is 100% straight, nor indeed 100% gay for that matter. I've yet to meet a woman who calls herself a lesbian who hasn't had a passing fancy of a man. Even the most dyed-in-the-wool lesbians I have encountered have been attracted to at least one male film star. However, I am not a woman who has passing crushes on other women. I am genuinely attracted to and fall in love with women as well as men. But until today, I have never openly admitted it. For women from my background, being bisexual meant that you presented to the world as straight. Having an out-in-the-open relationship with someone of the same sex was, and still to a certain degree is, forbidden. People like us simply do not come out. Let me expand a little. I went to the kind of girls' public boarding school which was so elite that we referred to the groundskeepers and kitchen staff as the proles. We were educated well, with the expectation of doing absolutely nothing with that education, other than becoming a most excellent wife of an elite public boarding school boy who would eventually become a politician, a judge, a brigadier general, or a surgeon. I need to explain to you about elite girls' boarding schools, lesbianism, and bisexuality. But before I elaborate further, ask yourself this. Have you ever met a woman from my background who is fully out of the closet? I'm not talking rich women on the cusp of middle and upper class here. I'm talking of the establishment. Do you know any woman, even a younger woman in these enlightened times, who is out and proud, a woman who goes on marches and takes her lover home to meet her parents? I'd be very surprised if you did. Yes, I know you are thinking about famous gay aristocrats, aren't you? But male and gay is different from female and gay. And besides, only the ones who are absolute artistic geniuses are made exceptions for. Even Vita Sackville-West, by remaining in Great Britain, had to conform to the institution of marriage. All her affairs with women were seen as scandalous and shameful, and rumours had to be quashed. The generation before me who lived through the Roaring Twenties did have a now somewhat romanticised clutch of lesbians who escaped to Paris, endeavouring to lead authentic lives while trying desperately not to get cut off from their family incomes. But not all of them managed it. Some were disowned altogether. Others eventually returned home and married men as instructed. Besides, by the time my generation came along, World War II had put paid to any freedoms those women had gained. My generation conformed to heterosexual marriage as women from the past had indeed conformed. My apologies. I digress again. I was talking about my school, where I was trained not to come out of the closet under any circumstances. My school, like most other girls' boarding schools, was, in actual fact, a hotbed of lesbian desire. Consider again for a moment my assertion that no woman is 100% heterosexual. All those girls cooped up together day and night with an all-female teaching staff. Did you really think we never touched one another? Of course, there were degrees of interaction, from those who had intense silent crushes to those who fiddled and fumbled a little in the dorms but never quite went all the way. And then there were girls like me, who were rolling around in the hay from the age of 11. The stables were where girls such as I found one another and explored one another. And the teachers, many of whom themselves had done plenty of rolling in the hay back in their day, never, ever came into the stables after 6 o'clock in the evening. It was an unwritten rule. Let me talk briefly about the teachers. I told you earlier that we, women of my class, were not permitted to come out. However, there were places where, so long as one said absolutely nothing and kept it absolutely private, lesbian sexuality was, and still is, tolerated. If one were so lesbian, one simply could not find a way of becoming a good wife, submitting oneself to a man or having intercourse with a man, then there were only 2 options for an adult female. If one were exceptionally academic, one could become a don at an elite university. Alternatively, if one were reasonably academic, one could become a teacher in an elite public boarding school. One would no longer be invited to social events other than christenings, weddings, and funerals, but one's reputation was sufficiently intact for one not to be a source of scandal. Out of sight, out of mind. Sadly, though, if one were not bright enough to escape into academia of any kind, then one simply had no choice but to marry someone one did not love. Or become an outcast. By outcast, I mean outcast. Cast out. No inheritance. Disowned. Totally alone. We have our own world, you know. We live in a parallel universe only inhabited by people like us. Behind black doors in Soho and Mayfair are private members' clubs to which only we are permitted. Our golf courses are not your golf courses. Our five-star hotels are not your five-star hotels. Even if you are new money and buy one of our deserted mansions, you will never be one of us, never be a part of our set. If you are not from our background but went to a good university, you might briefly have thought we were the same as you, just richer. The chances are we came to the Students' Union now and then. We may have been your good friend, or perhaps even slept with you in a moment of arch rebellion. But were you ever invited to one of our places or events? Or did we only come to yours? When we brought Mummy into university for a visit, did we, for some strange reason, only introduce Mummy to those who went to boarding school too, and accidentally forget about you? And within 2 years of graduation, were we still going out drinking with you on a Friday night? Did you ever, in fact, see us again? I have gone off at another tangent, I know, but only so you fully comprehend why I ended up making the choices I made, and causing myself untold misery as a consequence. I'd surmise that by this point in my account, some of you are sitting there, already hating me with a passion, thinking, why should I be listening to the rambling regrets of a posh old bitch who has had all of life's privileges and none of its hardships? And I would agree. But I am not telling you my story so you feel sorry for me. I just want you to hear how someone in her 80s could make a complete dog's dinner of her love life. So, as I began to recount, I spent a lot of time in the stables in my youth. I played around with and eventually made love with dozens of girls. In the sixth form, I even had a more formal relationship with a girl named Abigail. But I never expected this relationship to last, and neither did she. Even though we absolutely adored one another and had the most intimate union imaginable, we spent much of our time chatting about whom we might marry and whether we wanted to go to finishing school or, in my case, university first. There was no scenario where we thought we would actually be together. We simply assumed that if the feelings were still there and circumstances allowed, we would carry on seeing each other in secret. We both liked boys as well as girls, so the option of remaining on the periphery of the set and becoming a don or a teacher did not appeal to us. And besides, I wanted to become a doctor, which was controversial enough. When I told my parents that I wanted to go into medicine, they were not altogether surprised. Nonetheless, in 1953, it was still almost unheard of for a woman from my set to take up such a profession. Do not confuse me with the private schoolgirls a rung or two down the ladder. I mean from my background, old money, the aristocracy, the elite, families who are royalty or marry into royalty. Women like us did not have careers. I remember my mother sobbing, terrified that my wish to become a doctor would bring shame and scandal upon the family. But my father, who was a prominent MP, looked at me seriously and said, "Lucinda, If this were your sister asking, I would refuse my consent. However, you have the most exceptional mind I have ever encountered in a female, and for this reason I will allow it. But on one condition. If you pursue this controversial route, you must promise me that you will become no less than a surgeon with a Harley Street practice and be an expert in your field. And so I did. I did exactly that. I went to university, studied medicine, and then specialized in endocrine surgery. One might even say I was trained for a career in slitting other ladies' throats. Anyway, as expected, Abigail and I drifted once I went to university, and she went to finishing school. By the time she married Rafe, aged 19, I was already courting a fellow student named Jeremy, with whom I technically lost my virginity, despite having made love with over a dozen girls in every imaginable way before then. From then on, I made it my priority to sleep only with men. After all, I needed to find a suitable husband, and continuing on sleeping with girls would inevitably lead to dead-end relationships and pain. I am not going to sit here and tell you I did not enjoy making love with men. I am not a lesbian. Making love with a man feels completely different and services an entirely different set of physical and emotional needs and desires from making love with a woman. I have always wanted both, but have been forced since adulthood to choose the one of which society approves. There are those who claim that desiring both sexes is greedy. I disagree. It is not greed. It is need. I am a complex woman with a great many needs. No one person, male or female, could hope to fulfill all of them. I don't know why people think there is anything unusual about that. Marriage, of course, is an entirely different entity and involves a commitment to one person irrespective of other desires. During the third year of my degree, I met Sebastian, who was 2 years my senior, and the man who would become my husband for 40 years. I was very much in love with Sebastian. Intelligent, tall, dark, and handsome, he had just qualified at the bar and was, of course, one of us. He'd attended the correct school and came from a family whose name and land dated back to the 11th century. There were no serious family chats to ascertain whether this was a suitable alliance. His credentials alone were enough for him to be regarded as the perfect match. My parents did not even ask me whether I loved him. As it was, for the first 25 of our 40 years together, Sebastian and I were happy. It wasn't until he reached his late 40s and started sleeping with younger women that I finally fell out of love with him. He had, I think, until then remained faithful, but as with all marriages, our lovemaking had become sporadic between having our children and maintaining high-profile careers. And as his hair receded and lines became etched around his eyes, soon I was smelling other women's perfume on his clothes. I won't lie and say it didn't hurt. It did. But I felt that we could continue on being married, but both have lovers and remain friends. So once I had reconciled myself with the idea that he was never going to be true to me again, I decided to give in to one of the many crushes I had fought off. the one I had on my secretary, Leona, who had been working for me for over 5 years and had provided many a wild fantasy during my lonelier nights. It was when Sebastian caught me in bed with Leona that I stopped loving him altogether. He was furious in a way that I had never witnessed before, and told me my actions were reprehensible. I retorted that he was on at least his 4th secretary by now, so why was it such a problem for me to be on my 1st? To which he replied that it was different for men. He could survive, and our family would survive if he were caught sleeping with his secretary. Indeed, it was almost expected that a man of his age and stature would have at least one mistress by now. But I could not. Not with a man, and certainly not with a woman. I would tarnish our family name and ruin the marital prospects of our 2 daughters and the career prospects of our 2 sons. It was his hypocrisy that made me lose what love for him I had remaining. But then, with people like us, hypocrisy is rife. I mean, I have witnessed a woman who I went down on multiple times in the stables at school stand next to her politician husband and nod emphatically while he condemned homosexuality as a transgression worthy of roasting in hell. I have witnessed men who went to elite boarding schools, some of whom without doubt had relations with one another in the same way the girls did at mine, vote in Parliament against legislation to lower the age of consent, setting the fight for equality back by years as a consequence. Never doubt the old adage. There really is one rule for us, and an entirely different rule for you. This does not mean we should all be hated. There are plenty of us who are perfectly decent human beings who have tried to do some genuine good in this world. Flawed though I am, by becoming an endocrine surgeon, I both improved and saved countless lives, especially women's lives, as they are more prone to conditions such as thyrotoxicosis and hyperparathyroidism. Controversial though it was, I was allowed to continue operating even after I became a mother, because I was so utterly brilliant in my field. There is a lot about me to detest, but not that. Becoming a surgeon is the only thing in my life I am truly proud of. Anyway, after Sebastian caught me and made it clear in no uncertain terms that he would continue on sleeping with his secretary, but I had to stop sleeping with mine, our marriage became a frosty sea of toleration and keeping up appearances. We never made love again, nor even pretended to have any affection left for one another. Sebastian died, aged 63, of a massive stroke. I did shed a tear at his passing. After all, he was the father of my children and grandfather to a growing brood of grandchildren. So, in spite of the acrimony in the latter part of our marriage, I was nonetheless bereft and saddened. A while after Sebastian died, I began sleeping with other people again. Predominantly women whom I'd had encounters with at school and who had remained within my sphere. But whether they were widowed like me or being unfaithful, there was never any suggestion that such affairs would become full-blown relationships. The rules were still the same as they had been over 40 years previously. Eventually, though, once a fitting amount of time had passed, I found myself a male lover called Alexander, who came from my set and could therefore escort me to social engagements. We were together for 2 years. But although we were terribly fond of one another, we were never really in love. And inevitably he met someone else for whom he had those feelings, so we parted company amicably. Then, as I grew older, romantic interactions with both sexes gradually diminished. And by the time I met Camilla, at the age of 80, I had not made love with anyone for over 3 years. I first encountered Camilla when I was invited to be the keynote speaker at a 4-day conference on endocrine medicine, where I would talk about the pioneering work I had done in parathyroid surgery. Even though I had stopped practicing at 75, I still worked as a consultant and was a much esteemed figure in my field. Camilla, also an endocrine surgeon based in Manchester, had organised the event. She was 20 years my junior, but I felt connected to her from the moment we first met. I am not given to flights of fancy concerning spiritual matters, but there was something about this woman. The way in which we communicated, the things we discovered we had in common, my immediate attraction to her. It was as though we were fated to meet. On the first evening of the conference, after delivering my lecture, I found myself spontaneously drawing her into me for a hug. What I wasn't prepared for, though, was what this hug did to me, what she did to me. For suddenly, I was engulfed by a wave of healing energy, so overwhelming in its potency that it made me physically jolt, and I pulled away, unable to look her in the eye. Many years ago, I had attended an event where the concept of the medical practitioner's healing touch had been explored, and the speaker, a doctor who had been somewhat seduced by alternative medicine, had us experiment with laying hands on one another. Some of the participants said that they'd experienced a rush of healing energy surge through them, but I had felt nothing and had gone away thinking it a load of poppycock and new age bunkum. But this woman, this doctor, what her hug did to me, kept me awake all night. I simply could not stop thinking about her, could not stop wanting her arms around me once again, and this time not to back away, but instead fall into her embrace. Everything about her was wrong, of course. She was middle class, so not of my background, far too young, and yet more alarmingly, totally open about being a lesbian. She looked like a lesbian, walked like a lesbian, and talked like a lesbian. No one would ever have mistaken her for a heterosexual woman. She was a living advertisement for all things sapphic. But nonetheless, in spite of her being utterly incorrect in every conceivable way, I knew that this was not going to be a passing crush. And I had, in actual fact, fallen in love. Not love at first sight, but love at first hug. I categorically did not want to be in love with Camilla. Perhaps if she had been only a few years younger than I, or had had the same upbringing as I, then she would have understood why I could never have a relationship with a woman which was not clandestine by nature. But she was from the generation who had marched and fought for their right to love openly, without shame. A generation and a class who had simply refused to live in the shadows and keep their sexuality a secret. She was jeopardous, perhaps even disastrous to consider becoming involved with. Over the next 2 days of the conference, I attempted to avoid her, yet my efforts were in vain. For every time I even glanced in her direction, it was as though she somehow felt it and looked back at me immediately and smiled. However, whenever she approached me to actually converse, I remained distant and a little rude, unable to engage with her lest I gave my feelings away. I passed on all social activities and ordered room service in the evenings so I could avoid becoming further entangled. The power of the connection frightened me too greatly. On the 4th day, I was due to deliver the concluding lecture, and just before I left the wings to approach the podium, Camilla squeezed my hand, and the same tingling energy, imbued with healing love, rushed right through me. Turning to her in shock, I saw for the first time that she was in love with me too. Even though she had not flirted or gazed at me longingly or done any of the things people do when they desire someone else. My body still reverberating with electrical energy, I gave my speech, which received a standing ovation, Camilla clapping loudest of all. Afterwards, I was incapable of hiding away as before and went along to the hotel bar with my fellow attendees. I found myself seeking Camilla almost constantly, and each time our eyes met, her gaze penetrated through all of my defenses, straight into my heart. No, that's not quite right. It was deeper than that. Straight into my soul. By the time most delegates were heading to bed, I had drunk 5 large gin and tonics, and my resolve not to get involved with this woman had weakened considerably. When she finally sat next to me, I could not resist touching her knee with my own, and within a few moments we were covertly linking little fingers under the table, and the tingling recommenced. I imbibed yet another beverage, and when she said, "Would you like to join me in my room for a nightcap?" I had no defenses left. I was on fire. She kissed me as soon as her door swung shut, and it was a kiss like no other. Although I had made love with dozens of men and women in my 80 years on this mortal coil, never had I experienced anything quite so extraordinary. It was like a visitation from God, or perhaps I should say the goddess. Rapturous and terrifying in equal measure, I became lost in an ocean of ecstasy, a veritable sea of love. Every cell in my body feeling as though it were healing as a consequence of our union. I wish I could tell you that I then accepted this unique and spiritual connection. A profound love to be prized above all others. A gift so precious that I grasped onto it with both hands, in spite of my many reservations. But alas, I did not. Rather, after hours of blissful lovemaking, once Camilla had fallen asleep in my arms, I gently extracted myself, silently dressed, and then tiptoed away. I did not even attempt to go to bed. Instead, I packed my suitcase, called a taxi to the station, and left on the first train back to London. As the train forged ahead in the direction of home, I tried to make sense of what had occurred. Why was this feeling, This experience, this particular instance of falling in love, so different from when I fell deeply in love with Abigail or Sebastian. How could someone so totally wrong feel so absolutely right? On reaching my house, I went to bed immediately, exhausted by all that had transpired, and still unable to truly comprehend it. But my dreams were full of Camilla and our lovemaking, and when I awoke 3 hours later, I was yet more distressed. I staggered downstairs to check my emails, already knowing she would have contacted me. She was, in fact, somewhat guarded in her words. She did not chastise me for leaving without saying goodbye, but instead affirmed I was the most intelligent, impressive, and inspiring human being she had ever encountered, and what a privilege it was to hear me speak and spend such wonderful personal time with me. She then stated she would be in London in 2 weeks' time and asked if we could meet for dinner, signing off with the phrase, "Love and best wishes, Camilla." I emailed back immediately, telling her I'd had a fabulous time at the conference and wishing her best of luck for the future, but was unable to meet for dinner because I would be overseas by then. Which was a downright lie. In spite of all that we had shared, the passion, the bliss, the elation, I was unable to write what I actually felt, which was, I have fallen hopelessly in love with you, and all I want is to utterly lose myself in you for all eternity. Please come to me forthwith and never leave my side again. I could not even get as far as, please do join me for afternoon tea when you are next in London. She replied a few hours later to say she was sorry that I was away when she was in London, but to please let her know when I was back, as she would love to see me again, this time signing off with much love. I did not respond. I decided it better to retreat. But although we were now separated by 200 miles, I continued to feel our connection. It was still resonating through my body, through my very soul, irrespective of the physical distance. It was so bizarre that I did not even know whether to believe it were real or whether I was becoming fanciful in my old age. After all, I barely believed in God, let alone the concept of spiritual connections. Yet I was determined not to relent, and decided I would only answer emails concerning professional matters. I was not going to come out at the age of 80. Besides, even if she agreed to a secret relationship, being spotted more than once with someone so obviously lesbian would first arouse suspicion and then ultimately lead to a scandal from which I might never recover. I had grandchildren to consider after all. What might happen to their prospects were it to get out that Grandmama was embroiled in a sapphic relationship with a middle-class doctor from the north? As time went on, Camilla must have become frustrated with the lack of progress, as she invited me to more and more medical events, all of which I declined. Not because I didn't want to go, didn't want to see her, but because I knew that were I to see her, I would not be able to resist falling into her arms once again. Sometimes I came close to attending an event anyway, even if I'd refused her invitation. One day, I even found myself putting on my makeup and moving towards the coat stand, before stopping myself from going to her. And then, a few months later, the inevitable happened. I attended a day conference where I had no expectation of seeing her, but there she was, across the room. As soon as our eyes met, I felt myself fall yet more deeply in love. Suddenly, she was no longer a forbidden fantasy. She was there before me. In the first break, she came over to me, and as we embraced, my body began to quiver. But I pretended I felt nothing, experienced nothing, wanted nothing. She behaved as though our relationship was perfectly normal, and chatted about the conference and her work and asked about mine. In spite of the underlying sexual tension, there was still an ease with which we communicated, a natural flow from a shared way of looking at the world and common sense of humour. Then, as the conference recommenced, we returned to our seats like two people who just happened to know one another, rather than two beings who were madly in love. At luncheon, we were seated at opposite ends of the banquet hall. But all I had to do was glance in her direction, and as before, she would sense it and gaze back. Then, in the afternoon, I popped out to the ladies during a long and somewhat uninspiring lecture on new methods of treating pancreatitis. And as I was washing my hands, Camilla appeared through the door. It was I who pulled her into the cubicle. We made love standing up in silence, so still there was barely a rustle from our clothes. The kind of love-making I'd indulged in on countless occasions whilst at boarding school. Furtive, exhilarating, and perilous. The euphoria making me feel like a teenager again. Afterwards, when she went to speak, I pressed my finger to her lips, hearing the main door opening as someone else entered. When the nearby cubicle door swung shut, I extracted myself from her embrace, indicating I would leave first. Then I flushed the toilet and opened the door, leaving her to gently push it closed after me. As soon as we were parted, I found myself rushing to the exit and marching to the station without looking back. By the time I was at my desk, there was a fresh email from Camilla, begging me to call her. But I did not dare. If she had my phone number, even if I staved her off this time, I might not maintain my resolve in the future. I had to hold my nerve. I had been reckless. I had been unfair. There was no way I was going to have a relationship with this woman. So I simply ignored her. And all subsequent emails, professional or otherwise, until they stopped. I won't tire you by recounting the 4 other occasions a similar scenario unfolded. We would be thrown together at a conference, end up making love in a ladies' cloakroom, and then I would run away and ignore all ensuing communication. But nonetheless, I was still consumed by her. Indeed, I believed I felt her with me constantly, on some other plane or energetic frequency, as though we were having a relationship anyway, irrespective of my best efforts to defy it. I should have known that eventually one of us would crack. After over 2 years of this agonizing, preternatural union, interspersed with the occasional dose of real-world, clandestine lovemaking, I received an old-fashioned letter through the post. In it, She said that life was too short and she could no longer settle for unplanned illicit encounters. She declared she was in love with me and that she believed I felt the same way about her, and that she wanted to meet so we could talk properly about our extraordinary connection. I spent the next 2 weeks in a state of abject catatonia, barely able to eat or sleep. Part of me wanted to pick up the phone, confess I was madly in love with her, and ask her to come to me. But the other half of me was utterly horrified to see her words of love laid bare. Finally, after a fortnight had passed, I realized I had a moral duty to at least respond in some manner. I could not write that I was not in love with her. I simply could not. But in spite of the magnitude of my own feelings, I was still not prepared to relent. And so I wrote the vaguest reply possible, but one that I knew would end all further correspondence on the matter. It said, "I am sorry you feel so strongly about me, but I am not in a position to even countenance a relationship. Kind regards, Lucinda." As anticipated, I did not receive another letter, and though my heart shattered into 1,000 shards, I did not acquiesce and reach for her. Instead, I decided to stop attending medical conferences altogether. After all, I was 82 now. It wasn't as though I was obliged. I was aware of Camilla in spirit for nearly another year. However, in time, the feeling became intermittent until, eventually, her energetic presence diminished altogether. And I knew, simply knew, she had met someone else. And as a consequence, I became deeply lonely and consumed by regret. A few months on, now over 3 years since we had fallen in love, I finally saw Camilla once again. We were both attending a garden party hosted by an establishment peer, well known for making significant donations to medical institutions. She was accompanied by a woman who I instantly knew was her lover, and it utterly crippled me. The agony in my heart and solar plexus at seeing her happy with another was so excruciating, I could barely find my breath. As Camilla's new partner was swept away by a group of medics, I found myself walking towards her, finally wishing to discuss all that had passed between us. When I reached her, Camilla smiled, but despite her welcoming demeanor, there was pain in her eyes. Filled with remorse and longing for her love, I told her I was sorry that I hadn't been able to give her what she wanted, but I was happy that she had met someone who clearly had. Which was, of course, an outright falsehood, because I was now going out of my mind with jealousy. She said thank you and started to leave, but spontaneously I grabbed her arm, and the pain in her eyes increased tenfold. Suddenly, I heard myself saying, "I love you," even though I had vowed never to declare it. She looked at me in disdain, giving an indignant laugh. "I know you do, but that was never the problem, was it? The problem was you didn't want to. It was easier for you to break your own heart and deny our connection than have any kind of relationship with me. I tried to assert again that it was because I knew I could not give her what she wanted, at which point she became so furious with me, she almost drew attention to us. You never even asked what I wanted, you simply assumed. I mean, did you really think I'd force you to come out, set up house and get a cat? I was 62, for heaven's sake, not 22. I really wasn't dreaming of a white picket fence. On this, she marched away in the direction of her new girlfriend, and I was forced to slip out of the event and take the long way back to the station via the park, lest I be spotted weeping by someone I knew. As I walked, I contemplated what Camilla had said about expectations, and realized that I had indeed made unfounded assumptions. Her eyes had been wide open about the limitations of any long-term union between us, but she had wanted me anyway, loved me anyway, remained patient, too patient for her own good, while I had stubbornly resisted her, only to now find myself thoroughly inconsolable. I then took a long, hard look at myself. As an intelligent, exceptionally well-educated and brilliant successful surgeon, one would think I could have found a way to have a love life that was completely open and on my own terms. But no. For my entire existence, I had remained ensnared by the rules of people like us. I had demanded no more emotional freedom than those girls whom I had looked down on for settling for a life of purchasing just the right antiques and organizing soirees. I found myself wringing my hands in despair. Why did I just accept that Abigail and I could have no future? Why did I stop sleeping with Leona even though we were having a wonderful time, when my husband continued on sleeping with his secretary unfettered? Why, after he passed away, did I never consider even asking any of my subsequent female lovers to have a more formal relationship? And why, oh why, when I had found such true love, such a pure love with Camilla, had I thrown it away? Suddenly, I wanted to run to her. But I knew it was far too late. Even if she still had feelings, she would not relinquish her new lover to take another chance on me. I had lost her, and I had only myself to blame. They were married this morning, Camilla and her partner Lauren. There is no happy ever after for me. I will go to my grave knowing that I could have been deliriously happy until the day I died, were it not for my own intransigence. And I am furious with myself for not being more courageous, for conforming, and of course for hurting her so much. So, as of this day, the day when I have had to accept the heart-breaking ramifications of my own actions, I have decided to at last be brave, break ranks, overturn convention, and openly admit to the world, my world, who I am. I will never pretend or deny it again. I shall finally say it. I shall even shout it from the rooftops. For perhaps This will help someone else from my set not to make the same egregious mistakes as I. Break the cycle and end this ridiculous charade performed by people like us. My name is Lucinda, and I am bisexual.
People Like Us was written, directed and produced by Rachel Dax, performed by Suzie Rees, with music by Michael O. Lewis and Soundscape by David Shell.